I wanted to update you on a few things related to the next topic, which is biosocial development during the first 2 years of life. And the first thing I'd like to mention is that of sudden infant death syndrome. In my lecture that you'll see later and hear, um, I talk about all the different things that correlate with sudden infant death syndrome. And I discuss the fact that nobody really knows for sure what causes sudden infant death syndrome. Uh, on page 127 of the latest edition of our textbook, they talk about a number of factors that have been occasionally found to be associated with sudden infant death syndrome, including low birth weight, winter, being male, exposure to cigarettes, soft blankets or pillows, bed sharing, crib bumpers, respiratory infections, and physical abnormalities, in particular in the brainstem, heart, mitochondria, and microme. Well, I have a chart in my lecture that shows a lot of these different things. But a study that was done in Australia by a researcher who was determined to get to the bottom of the sudden infant death syndrome thing, disorder, cause, concluded, and you might want to read about this study on page 127 of your text. She concluded that the number one factor was putting kids, infants I'm talking about, to bed on their stomachs, and recommended putting them to bed on their backs. In particular, they found that a rather large group of Chinese parents basically did not have any cases of sudden infant death syndrome, and all of these parents put their infants to bed on their backs. This is interesting because when my kids were infants, pediatricians were saying put them on their tummies as one way to avoid sudden infant death syndrome. And since this study came out that your textbook talks about, and it's produced very few cases of sudden infant death syndrome now that parents are being advised to put their infants to sleep on their backs. What's interesting to me about all of this is one theory that's always been out there is that SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, is an infant version of sleep apnea, which affects adults. These are people who just all of a sudden stop sleeping. Listen to me. They stop breathing. I'm sorry. Multiple times during the night. And a lot of them are overweight, and they've typically snore rather loudly, and basically they'll snort and it forces air back into their lungs. And, the only effective treatment for sleep apnea seems to have been use of a CPAP machine, which CPAP stands for continuous positive airway pressure. It's basically a mask that you would wear at night, and it's connected to a compressor, and it forces air into the person all night. I talk about it extensively when I teach Introduction to Psychology. And amazingly, every class I've ever taught, if I ask students, do you know anyone who uses a CPAP machine? A rather large number of students in every class I've ever taught has indicated that somebody they knew used a CPAP machine. Well, what's interesting about that is the two things they tell adults who have sleep apnea is, of course, to use a CPAP machine, but also to not sleep on their backs. Do not sleep in the supine position. So, if sudden infant death syndrome is in any way related to sleep apnea, then it's interesting that it doesn't seem to affect infants by putting them on their backs, but you would think people would be advised not to put them on their backs. So it's all very confusing, I think. Your textbook states that by 1994, a back to sleep campaign cut the SIDS rate dramatically. By 1996, the SIDS rate in the United States was half of what it had been. And in 2015, the Centers for Disease Control reported that there were only 1,600 SIDS deaths in the United States. Well, that's still a lot of deaths. It's worth a shot, definitely, if you have an infant today. When you put your baby to sleep, start them out on their backs. But remember, correlation does not necessarily imply causation, and there still are other factors that, just because you place your infant on their back, that may greatly reduce the chance of SIDS, but it doesn't completely eliminate it. The other thing I wanted to bring up, which is a real mystery, and that is the increased rates of autism in the United States. When I was an undergraduate, I took a course in speech. And one of the speeches that I gave was on this very unusual disorder called autism. I had read an article in Psychology Today magazine about this rare disorder called autism. And so I gave a speech about it. It was so rare that the cases were so rare that people didn't really know exactly what it was. There were certain symptoms some of these folks had, but in the beginning, some people mistakenly diagnosed these people as having mental retardation was the term we used back then. Now it would be called an intellectual disability. Some of them were diagnosed with having schizophrenia and so on, but it was a very rare disorder. And so, it made kind of a neat 5-minute speech for me to give to my speech class. We're talking 1970 here, okay? By the way, I made an A on the speech. It was fascinating. It was a fascinating article. Now, all of a sudden, there's an epidemic of autism. It's everywhere. 6.7 out of every 1,000 children were diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder in the year 2000. So, in 1970, this thing was unheard of. And yet, in 2000, 6.7 children out of every 1,000 were diagnosed with it. And that number had risen to, get this, 27.6 children out of every 1,000 by the year 2020. I was a school psychologist for 9 years, and I never once made an autism diagnosis. Looking back on my career, there was one kid at Sunset Valley Elementary that I think probably was autistic. He was a fascinating kid. They had diagnosed him as learning disabled, but he wasn't really learning disabled, because in those days, to be learning disabled, you had to have average intelligence, and you had to be achieving significantly below your intelligence in various areas of achievement. And he wasn't. In fact, on intelligence tests, he scored in the mentally deficient range, but he certainly wasn't mentally retarded either, which was the term that we used back then. I had a real dilemma with this kid, because the autism diagnosis, I'm talking 1977 here, didn't even exist for school psychologists to use. And the best thing I could do, since he wasn't really learning disabled and he wasn't really mentally retarded, if you will, today we'd call it intellectually disabled, I ended up diagnosing him as emotionally disturbed. I had no other choice. I remember telling his parents, I don't want to, this is the only diagnosis I have. He obviously needs special education services, and I hate to call him emotionally disturbed, but I have no other diagnosis. But he had, looking back on it, he had symptoms of autism in 1977. But I made it all the way through the rest of my career and never once made an autism diagnosis. And many years after I had gone into private practice, I remember this boy who was in second grade at the time was now a young adult, and I remember running into him in the grocery store with his father, and he had all these autistic mannerisms. He was an interesting kid. I would have counseling sessions with him, and how does a typical second grader dress? Boy, blue jeans, some kind of tennis shoes, a t-shirt. Not this kid. He would wear golf shirts, nice kind of dress slacks, wingtip shoes, which back in 1977 is what businessmen wore. He always was very neatly dressed. He had his hair combed perfectly, and I remember we would sit in a room to have a counseling session, and he'd sit on the chair and cross his legs and look at me, and he'd say, "Well, Dan, what would you like to talk about today?" As if he was the psychologist and I was the client. Interesting guy. But I made it all the way through a 40-year career, never once diagnosing anybody with autism. Yet, now, the latest statistics show that one kid out of every 36 in the US get diagnosed with an autism spectrum disorder. This is up from 1 in 150 20 years ago in the United States. And, when I was in grad school, and even when I was a school psychologist, how many people had autism? Virtually nobody. It was so rare that, these were just interesting cases that people didn't know what to think about. Suddenly they're everywhere. Okay, so why the increase? It isn't just that people have gotten better at diagnosing it. What factors correlate with this? That's the question I would have. And, one of the things that comes up in this topic of the first 2 years of life is getting kids immunized. Now, that was no issue at all when I was growing up. Vaccines were considered essential to wiping out horrible diseases that had adverse effects on people. But in recent years, vaccines have come under a lot of they've been involved in a lot of controversy, period. And there have been a number of studies that tried to link autism to vaccines. And there was a researcher in Austin, as a matter of fact, who was associated with this. And, most of the literature would suggest vaccines don't have anything to do with autism. Well, what does then? I don't know. How do you feel about vaccines? How many of you got vaccinated for COVID? And did you get another shot? Maybe 3 or 4 shots for COVID. And did you get COVID anyway? I got vaccinated twice for COVID, and then I got COVID. And I had a lot of the long-term side effects of COVID for an extended period. I think I'm finally totally recovered now, but you never know. What about you? How many of you got vaccinated and got COVID anyway? How many of us knew somebody who didn't get vaccinated and got COVID and died? Is the COVID vaccine effective? In recent years, I've gotten a couple of vaccinations for pneumonia, and when you get to be my age, they recommend that you get these pneumonia vaccines as a preventative measure, and so far they've been effective. So, the whole vaccination thing has gotten controversial. And if we get another round of COVID, how many of us are going to bother getting vaccinated again? And how do you feel about government telling you you must? Or is this a decision you should be able to make on your own? And isn't it interesting that you can't get vaccinated for COVID in your physician's office? You can get a flu shot there. That's where I got my pneumonia vaccines. But physicians weren't given COVID vaccines to give to their patients. What's going on here with all of this? Well, these are all questions that will come up and that we will be exploring in the weeks ahead. So that's a little introduction to the next topic of study. Thanks for tuning in.